Good morning, everyone. It's exciting to see everyone joining in to today's conference, the Church Law and Finance Conference 2020. My name is Erika Cole. As you heard, I'm known as the church attorney. This is an exciting time. Like everyone else, we've had to pivot the way that we would normally do things. We would typically be in person for our conference, which initially began in 2007. So, but we are utilizing this platform, are excited to have you with us today. And we're going to move forward with our invocation by Rob Eby from Aronson, LLC. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Erika. I'm excited to be here today with each of you. And I know Erika and I have been praying for this event for months. And so let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're excited to get going. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time where we could gather together. Lord, allow this time to be one that brings honor to you. Help us to be encouraged by this time as well as we look through scriptures, as we discuss cases, as we look at accounting issues. Lord, allow us to be encouraged to know that you love us and that you have blessed us. And Lord, I also want to just take a second, and I know there's a number of pastors on this call. Lord, I just ask that you would bless the pastors that are participating today, empower them to lead, bless them and their family, protect them and their family, Lord. We thank you for those that you have called to this role. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, Rob. All right, well, again, welcome to the Church Law and Finance Conference. My name is Erika Cole. I'm really grateful to be able to share with you today about churches in distress, legal solutions for today's challenges. We certainly take the viewpoint that while there are some notable challenges, we are grateful to know that there are some solutions, and obviously God is number one. I'm here to share about some legal solutions for your consideration. So let's just start off talking a little bit about where we left off pre-COVID, because it seems like that's become a major marker. And before I do that, though, let me just move through the agenda for today. So I'm going to share the plenary session, and then we will hear from Richard Hammar. Richard is really a seminal leader in the area of church law. He is an attorney, also a CPA, and the senior editor at Church Law and Tax. He's going to speak today about the impact on churches of recent Supreme Court cases. And then we will have our panel discussion. On the panel, we're going to be discussing, Dr. Bobby Manning will discuss embracing the uncomfortable, the topic of racial reconciliation. Obviously, we are seeing many of the issues in our country, and Dr. Manning is going to have that discussion with us. And then we'll have a presentation on virtual reality, how current circumstances require a heightened online presence by Azuna Ananyua. And then protecting our houses of worship and the reentry process in the COVID-19 world by Mitch Lustig of the PMM companies. And then we will have time for Q&A, hopefully. So we do ask if you have any questions, go ahead and send them in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. And then finally, Rob Eby, the CPA and partner with Aronson, LLC, our partner in today's event, is going to present on the topic, ministry in an unstable revenue environment. And he'll also be sharing with us all some next steps so that we can stay in touch following today's event. All right, so starting with where we were pre-COVID, in some ways it seems awfully hard to imagine that there was a life pre-COVID, but the church certainly was facing some challenges at that time, certainly diminishing cultural influence. There's the reality of in the U.S., certainly declining church membership. In fact, it was presented by Gallup that church membership among U.S. adults had declined basically by 20 percentage points over as many years. So, you know, that obviously presented some major issues. And then as well, considerations around our clergy and perhaps a bit of a clergy shortage. But interestingly enough, during the course of COVID, for the first time since 2013, Gallup's annual tracking poll indicated that confidence in the church actually increased through this period of time. Many of you have likely pivoted with your church in providing different manners of service while perhaps not being able to be in the church building itself. So we are seeing that in spite of the challenges, the church has very much risen to many of the issues that we're seeing in this world. I heard the quote, "The wind cannot move the mountains," and I do believe that the church is a great reflection of that quote. So returning to in-person church gatherings, obviously there are major legal liability considerations around that very tough decision. Many of you joining us today have had to work with your teams, with your leadership, and maybe you've even polled your congregation, your volunteers around their level of comfort of returning to in-person church gatherings. From a legal standpoint, the chief liability consideration is making the decision to have folks return to the building and someone making the allegation that they contracted the virus at church. And perhaps one step removed, maybe that person doesn't allege that he or she contracted the virus at church, but his or her family member or coworker or some other place where that person may have gone following being at church. So that is obviously the biggest consideration around safety, right? Because churches want to ensure that visitors, volunteers, etc., are safe when the doors are open again. Now, one of the, I think I'll just take a poll at this moment to ask the question whether your church has returned to in-person gatherings. So is your church currently holding in-person gatherings? Just select one, yes or no, and we'll see what those of you who are joining us now are currently doing. All right, and once you've had a chance to vote, we should be able to see those results in pretty short order. Very interesting. So of those who are attending currently, and let me just say, there are a lot of you. There were, I think at last check, we cut it off at 1,100 people who could register for today's event. And I think at last check, you were from 42 of the 50 states. So there are a lot of you. And it looks like 63% of you have returned to in-person church gatherings. That's interesting to see. All right. So when we come to the question of returning to in-person gatherings, the major consideration, as I said, is around the safety of individuals, but I want you to consider how the courts have weighed in. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this particular topic because I believe that Richard Hammar is going to go into this discussion in greater detail. But just like it's a novel virus for humans and for the human system, is likewise a novel legal consideration for the court. So the truth is, we just don't have a lot of information around how the courts may decide these things, but we do have some information. So in one instance, obviously looking at the Supreme Court is a primary point of consideration, it being the highest court. So there's a case from California that comes out of California, and a church essentially said that it was an infringement on the church's rights in order for the court to, for the California governor to limit the attendance of the church. And the court denied the injunctive relief that was sought, essentially indicating that it is sometimes necessary for there to be restrictions for safety reasons. Likewise, in a similar case in the state of Illinois, the court concluded that the executive order from the Illinois governor was necessary and neutral, which with respect to religion, and supported by the compelling need to safeguard public health. So while there can be instances where maybe there's overreaching, what we have seen primarily is that courts have been supporting the decisions to protect the health of individuals in the state. So another area where we're seeing a lot of issues when it comes to particularly the virtual world, and that we want churches to be mindful of, is copyright materials. So considering the church and copyright infringement. When it comes to matters of copyright, they are meant to protect creators, right? So whether that's books, music, movies, etc. In this virtual world, where churches, especially even if they've returned to in-person gatherings, many churches I've found are continuing with their virtual presence as well. So it's important to be mindful that if you use any music, if you are even, I would say, if you have individuals who are, let's say, on the worship team or volunteering otherwise, who will be on screen, you would do well to actually have some sort of agreement that allows the likeness and any of the presentations to be used by the church with permission. Now, here are a couple of cases that I think are telling. The first case regards this publishing company that sued a Tennessee church because they were using songs on the church's website without permission. Now, I have to tell you, I think that's something that's very easy to happen. I will say I'm also actually on the worship team at my church, and I'm grateful that they're particularly cautious. But I think it's something that can happen without any malintent. But unfortunately, the penalties are quite stiff. So in this instance, the suit was for $150,000 for each infringement, which generally goes to each usage of the song each time it was. Sometimes I've even heard allegations toward each time it was viewed by someone, that there would be a penalty attributed, so plus attorney's fees. So it's important to note this. In another case, the publishing company essentially alleged that the church went beyond the scope of the license that it purchased. So again, unlike the former case where there was no license, in this instance, the church actually had a license, but it used its license, it used a greater percentage or beyond the capacity of the license that it purchased. So we take away from this the importance of, if you're using anything that comes under the umbrella of copyright, and certainly music goes with worship services quite hand in hand. You want to make sure that you have a license, and you want to make sure you have the right license for your particular usage. Now, again, in COVID world, one of the things that we saw and we were able to assist our clients with as well is walking through the process of applying for a PPP loan. Now, the reality is that it was a very interesting process, and it felt like the facts were changing daily, or we were getting more information from the SBA daily about what loans would be available, what the requirements would be, etc. At this point, of course, the PPP loans have there are no more loans being provided. We're moved to the point where people are now, I say people, really churches and other organizations are now in the place of applying for loan forgiveness. So the PPP loans essentially provided support for an 8-week period for employees, basically paying for employees as well as a smaller percentage for rent, mortgage, etc. So that was a positive way to move forward for many organizations that qualified and actually received their PPP loans. Now, again, as I said, people are moving forward. These organizations are moving forward with forgiveness. And just a day ago, we got from the Internal Revenue Service instruction about how, for tax purposes, these loans should be accounted for. So the information on this arena is steadily coming out. Certainly many churches have had to make financial adjustments. I've heard from many churches that when they were exclusively online, they found that they had a greater attendance online than they did in person. And while there was difficulties initially, perhaps for churches that did not already have a methodology for people to give when they're not in person. So in other words, my husband and I, we give using our church's app. We did that even when we were in person. So it was very easy to transition to give using the app when we were no longer in person. Many other churches might use things like Givelify or have a link on their website. Some churches really had to learn to pivot during this time, a word that I think is a perfect reflection of being able to continue forward, making adjustments. So those financial adjustments both came in the form of methodologies for receiving donations, tithes, offerings, as well as utilizing government programs. While I identify the PPP loan, because I think we've all probably heard that by now as a federal, if you did not qualify, or if you still want to see what could be available, you might want to look toward your state or local options at this point. Corporate governance is another area where we find that we may need to make some adjustments. So again, moving in the world where we weren't able to meet in person for a window of time and still needing to conduct church business, many churches found that their corporate documents did not allow for the necessary flexibility. So a key takeaway from this for your church is to review your core corporate documents, which for this purpose, I would say your articles of incorporation, and to your bylaws. Specifically, your bylaws being the governing document for your church should indicate how and under what circumstances you can hold meetings. If you don't have any provision that allows you to meet your board specifically, or governing portion of your church to meet other than in person, now is definitely the time to make that update. So generally speaking, when I'm preparing such a document, I want to make sure that you can meet virtually and using any methodology that allows you to be heard as a speaker and for others, for you to hear others. So take the time now to review your corporate documents and make any necessary updates. Church volunteers. Well, we often see statistics around church volunteers and just how important they are and what percentage of the church is actually operated by volunteers. Most of us are not on salary for the service that we provide the church. The church really runs on volunteers. Now, we actually see that this quote, it turns out that giving time and money go hand in hand. Those who give more financially to the church are often the volunteers. So it's very important that we consider the role of our volunteers and the legal considerations around that. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that volunteers donated to charity at double the rate of non-volunteers. And this is particularly important because we want to make sure our volunteers are protected, right? So as they're giving their time, as they're giving their resources, you want to make sure that your volunteers are well trained, that they have received clear instruction around the do's and don'ts of their operations, no matter what area they're in. So for example, you have volunteers who work with youth. You want to be clear that there is some child protection policy in place, that your volunteers are trained on that policy, that they are clear about what they should do and how they should report, and all of those things. So in any area where you have volunteers at work, please consider making sure that you have a volunteer policy, that your volunteers are well trained, because they are obviously there to serve and are a huge component of the church. Now, we talked in a prior slide about the PPP loan and about the fact that it went toward primarily employment, to be able to keep employees on, so that we weren't getting even more people having to file unemployment. But the 8-week time period for the PPP loan and being able to pay employees out of that that time period has expired. So the truth now is that we're having more conversations with churches that need to adjust their staffing. It's unfortunate to lose any employee, but in order for churches to be sustained, they're wanting to have a level of counsel around whether a layoff or a furlough or a reduction in force makes the most sense. So let's talk about those three things. So a layoff is kind of like a general term that we hear people use, but we want to distinguish between these areas. So a furlough generally is when we are having an individual who is, unlike layoffs, furloughs are less talked about, but they're also a temporary reduction to help the company get through financial woes. So a furlough is generally going to be a temporary time period, at least that's the intention. So while you may not give a specified time period on the front end, if you believe that your church will likely bounce back because perhaps you're seeing the financial trajectory, and we're going to be hearing from Rob Eby, who's going to talk more about the financial component. But if you have a reasonable anticipation that this is for a limited window, and you're seeing maybe the giving pick up, you're expecting financial support at some date certain, a furlough may be the right selection for you, for your church. So it's generally expected to be for a limited period of time. Unlike a layoff, again, a layoff is a temporary separation from payroll, but it is generally because there's just not enough work for that position or that individual. So if a position, perhaps, I'll use this example. If you had someone who, by virtue of their job, was maybe a receptionist, welcoming people into the church facility, and the facility is closed, then there's not likely a need or work for that individual. Then a layoff may be the best choice. On the other hand, a reduction in force is, generally speaking, an elimination of a position, and certainly an elimination of that person for that position at this time. So a reduction in force is much more permanent as a general matter. So it's really important to maybe have a full assessment of your entire staff, reviewing the job descriptions that are there, and considering whether and how to roll out any employment changes that might be necessary as we continue in this long-term place of changes within our nation overall. And I'm going to use this opportunity to mention the importance of proper designation of church employees. These are, I get the question quite often, whether a worker would be designated as an employee or an independent contractor. In fact, I think at one of the conferences some years ago, I specifically had a session regarding this question, because and I had a conversation with a client maybe 2 days ago. There's a church that's based in California, and they were asking whether the rules are different for churches when it comes to worker designation. And my response was, the IRS has these 22 points of consideration around whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. And generally speaking, the analysis is the same, but churches operate different really from any other kind of entity. So I think the application of the analysis can be more difficult for churches, but nevertheless, the IRS is giving an increased level of scrutiny around this designation. And I will say that sometimes workers they will say, I want to be designated as an independent contractor, right? Because it means that they get all of the payment up front, and really the church will have to trust that they will, that the worker will address any financial responsibilities as far as taxes are concerned on the back end. But unfortunately, we don't just get to decide that designation. There is some instruction around an independent contractor versus an employee, and the IRS sees the element of control as a seminal part of that distinction. So in other words, if the church has the ability to control the workers when they arrive, if the church provides the equipment for the worker, if the church provides the hours, etc., those are all points of consideration. But I would just encourage you to take a look at your worker designation as a part of this analysis. I wanted to just share this information too about mental health at church. The reality is that as a part of employment, since we're having the employment discussion, your employee assistance information should be easily accessible to your workers. This obviously is a stressful period of time as a general matter. And so just make sure that as you provide worker benefits, your employee assistance plan information should be readily accessible. This is also the time where you'd want to consider how your church manages counseling. Generally speaking, and this could be a whole discussion in of itself, but when it comes to counseling, you want to be sure that you don't dip over into the place of professional counselor as opposed to providing what I call biblical guidance. So it is generally to the greater protection of the church to provide biblical guidance as opposed to moving toward being true counselors, because then that gives rise to the level of scrutiny and analysis of a counselor. All right, church property matters is one of the biggest areas of legal concern for churches. It is Church Law and Tax has produced, and I think I've shared this slide at any number of presentations with their permission. They have provided a list of the top areas of lawsuits for churches. The top area is generally, unfortunately, child sexual abuse, and right under it is generally church property matters. As a personal note, I came to know quite early, probably in 6th grade, that I wanted to be an attorney. But believe it or not, I thought I wanted to do family law, which I don't have any interest in, actually. But it wasn't until I had the opportunity to clerk for the chief judge of our highest court, and a church property dispute came before the court. And before that time, even though I was raised in the church, I often tell the story that my dad was the head trustee and my mom was my Sunday school teacher. Like, church was our life, and it was a sweet place. So it never occurred to me that churches went to court. So this case comes before the chief judge that I'm clerking for, and I asked him to assign me the case so that I could do all the research. And it was a dispute between the local church and the denomination. And so these church property matters are real issues, particularly now as we see more independent churches and the role of denominations shifting, and people's desire to connect maybe more with fellowships or associations as opposed to denominations. So there are a lot of these shifts that are happening. So it's important to keep those considerations in mind. Now, if you're a church that's actually renting during this time, one of the things that you want to consider is commercial leases. Check to see if you have a force majeure clause, which is a clause that essentially means a force greater than yourself. Something occurred, and certainly COVID is often used in this reference. That means that you may no longer be able to continue in the lease, or maybe even need to adjust the rent payments, etc. We're also seeing that, in the area of retail, restaurants, etc., and also in commercial office spaces, there's a lot of question around our retail footprint at this point, because so many people are working from home. People are actually finding it to, in a lot of cases, be productive, and for some people even more productive. Large church buildings and multiple campuses create unique issues, perhaps in comparison to smaller church buildings. So, for example, when the various states allowed people to go back into church buildings, it usually was at some level of capacity. So 25% capacity, and then 50% capacity, and maybe 75% capacity. If you're a church that seats 5,000, 75% capacity could be a bit unwieldy in the current universe of things. So in any event, church property matters are a major point of consideration. I'm going to pause here for our second poll. So Clara, if you can put that up. I'd like to hear, what is your role at your church? If you would select one of these options. Are you on the board of directors or board of trustees? Are you a pastor or a part of the pastoral leadership team? Are you in an administrative role or other? All right. Thank you so much. We will. Interesting, quite a spread there. So it looks like 18% of you are on the board, the governing board, and then we've got 1 out of 5 of you is the pastor on the pastoral team, and a huge portion, 50%, is administrative, and then 12% other. Thanks so much for sharing that. So each of you certainly has a strong fiduciary component. So we're glad that you're with us. So I want to talk to pastors specifically at this moment, since they're 1 out of 5 of you is a pastor or on that pastoral team. Let me just mention, I'm running out of time, but I do want to raise this question again. I've presented on this topic of who owns the pastor's sermon, and it's always an interesting dialogue, because I very much understand that pastors, labor. My husband is an elder, so pastors, labor to come before people with a message that is divinely inspired, and so it feels like it is from the pastor, and of course it is. But from an IP standpoint, an intellectual property standpoint, there is this concept of works made for hire. So work that is done in the context of one's employment is generally anticipated being work that is owned by the employer. I mean, that's the general rule. And you know how the law works, right? There's the rule, and then there's an exception to the rule, and there may be an exception to the exception. So the general rule is the concept of works made for hire, but there may be an arrangement. You certainly can have an arrangement. I encourage you to have an arrangement between the pastor and the church anytime there may be any licensing desires that are different from that presumption, that legal presumption. And I would also say if you're a pastor that perhaps you write books, you write songs, you go out and speak quite a bit, independent of your work with the church that you serve as pastor for, you want to make sure that you have a legal firewall between the work that you do, independent of your employment in the church, and your work at the church. And I also want to make this pitch toward pastoral estate planning. I think there's a quote that says the cobbler's kids have holes in their shoes, something to that effect. Often those of us who serve so many others, you may not take into consideration the work that is needed at home. So I would really encourage you around succession planning, which is obviously what you're doing for the church, right? Ensuring that there's a clear plan of succession. I always say when succession planning, either we're talking about a process or a person. So if you don't know the person, then ensure that there's a process. And even if there is a person, you still want to make sure there's a process. But you also want to have estate planning so that your family can feel confident that their next steps are met as well. I'm going to wrap up real quickly around these additional legal considerations. The aging clergy and succession planning. Half of all current senior pastors are over the age of 55, according to Barna. And historically, and I've seen it time and time again in my more than 2 decades of representing churches, successions are inherently disruptive. I mean, even with thoughtful planning, it can go way more smoothly, obviously, but with no thoughtful planning, it is historically disruptive and litigious, I might just say. Many pastors are, like other professions, are using COVID to shift out of pastoral leadership if that time has come. They're just using this as a time to plan and make that strategy, and that can be great if that's where you're feeling led. Church attendance, we talked about that decline, but we are hoping that with this shift and the excitement of returning back to in-person worship, we'll see how that moves forward. The search for other sources of revenue, the legal considerations around that are big. So whether that's solar leasing or space sharing or other ways to decrease outflow, there are legal considerations associated with each of these things. We talked about intellectual property at church and about the importance of adopting policies that support church volunteers. So I will just say that in conclusion, change has been accelerated due to COVID, and churches, like every other institution, back to that word, have had to pivot. But as we saw from the earlier poll, churches are now viewed in a heightened positive way because of how we've been able to contribute to our communities during this time. And while our message has gone broadly, the message of the church has gone broadly a lot because of the virtual component, the reality is that we've physically been close to our own communities, and maybe that's been a part of the positive shift. And so planning for the next stage, we don't know what the future holds, although we know who holds the future, but planning for the next stage is crucial, and the time to plan is now. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share. I'm 2 minutes into Rich's time, so I'm going to stop here and introduce our next speaker. Richard Hammar, so start it over. At this time, I'd like to welcome Richard Hammar, attorney, CPA, best-selling author, and senior editor at Church Law and Tax. He specializes in legal and tax issues for churches and clergy, and will speak about recent Supreme Court cases and their impact on churches. Welcome, Richard.
Hello, Erika. It's my privilege to be with you today. Let's see if I'm able to work my slides here. Okay, there we go. Again, thank you for inviting me to participate in the conference today, Erika. I admire you greatly in the work that you do. In fact, you were selected to be one of the advisory editorial committee members at churchlawandtax.com, which is a great honor. And it's just a pleasure to work with you. This coronavirus pandemic, if there's a silver lining to it, it's that it's taught us to do things like this, to communicate electronically, online. I'll be talking about that more later. But I know I've spoken to hundreds, maybe thousands of venues over the years. And I remember it kind of peaked out. I agreed to speak at a conference in Bismarck, North Dakota. And it took me 2.5 days to get there. I spoke for an hour and then 2.5 days to get. That was a horrible use of my time. That showed me I've got to change. Now, this is probably 15 years ago. And I decided to start utilizing electronic technology. And at first, event sponsors they wanted me there in person. They didn't want electronic images. And I increasingly said, well, that's the way it's going to be. I'm either going to be there electronically or I'm not going to be there. And so over time, things kind of shifted over, and this technology became more popular. When I'm standing in the kitchen and my kids say to my wife, "Mommy, who's that man standing there?" It's time to cut back. But this has been great. It's slashed my travel, and I'm able to take on many. I've spoken to many conferences this way, church board meetings, denominational board meetings of trustees, et cetera. It's been great. So it's a great technology, and churches are utilizing it now increasingly. My church is, to do electronic online services. Well, I want to look at a couple of Supreme Court decisions. In fact, there's 5 of them that have been decided in the last couple of months that I want you to be aware of. And the first one is, are churches subject to COVID-19 restrictions? As you know, in most states and communities, health agencies, sometimes the governor, sometimes the legislature, have enacted regulations that limit assemblies, limit the number of people that can meet at any venue. Houses of worship are part of this. And in many places, you've seen it on the national news, some pastors are defying these restrictions. It's been true in California. It's been true in Nevada and many other states. There's a battle taking place. Church leaders think, some of them, that it's our constitutional right to the freedom of religion enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution to exercise our religion. And that supersedes, or that transcends these government health regulations. I mean, we have a right to meet, and the government can't tell us otherwise. Well, the Supreme Court has addressed this issue twice. The first case was the South Bay Pentecostal Church versus Newsom. It was a California case that worked its way up to the Supreme Court. In that case, it was about 50. I think you were limited to 50 members on site, and so that went up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled in favor of the government, that Governor Newsom, his executive order that limited church attendance was constitutional. And here's what the court said in part. Although California's guidelines place restrictions on places of worship, those restrictions appear consistent with the Free Exercise of Religion Clause. Similar or more severe restrictions apply to comparable secular gatherings, including lectures, concerts, movie showings, spectator sports, and theatrical performances, where large groups of people gather in close proximity for extended periods. And the order of the governor exempts or treats more leniently only dissimilar activities, such as grocery stores, banks, and laundromats, in which people neither congregate in large groups nor remain in close proximity for extended periods. So the basic idea here is, if comparable secular organizations are treated no better than a church, you don't have a constitutional claim. And that's what the court concluded. It was a 5-4 decision in this case. And similarly, the court also pointed out that our Constitution principally entrusts the safety and health of the people to the politically accountable officials of states to guard and protect. When those officials undertake to act in areas fraught with medical and scientific uncertainties, their latitude must be especially broad. So here's 5 takeaway points from this case. Churches may not be able to look to the courts for assistance when confronted by a state or local restriction restricting their ability to conduct worship services. So a pastor that says, I don't care what the government says, we're going to hold worship services like normal. Our right to practice our religion supersedes or transcends the right of government to protect our health. Well, we have 2 Supreme Court decisions now that have rejected that idea. So you proceed with caution. Number 2, churches, this is an important point that's being missed by a lot of people. Churches can challenge restrictions on attendance that are stricter than those that apply to comparable secular organizations. So if you can prove that comparable secular organizations are being treated more leniently, you got a case. So that's a very important point to make out. So number 3, the court stressed that our Constitution entrusts the safety and health of the people to the politically accountable officials of the states. Number 4, the Jacobson case was referred to by the Supreme Court. This is a 1905 decision by the Supreme Court in which the court upheld a Massachusetts law that mandated that every person be inoculated, vaccinated for smallpox. And the Supreme Court ruled that that was a permissible exercise of the police power of the state. And number 5, this is important now. What are the consequences of continuing to meet in violation of state or local health regulations? You defy them. We're going to meet. Well, let me mention 3 potential consequences. That's your decision. I'm not going to make that decision for you. But I think you need to make an informed decision and consider these 3 points. Number 1, personal liability for church board members. Do you know that in your state, like every state, there is legislation that provides limited immunity from liability to uncompensated board members of nonprofit organizations? That's a wonderful and a powerful inducement. And the reason for these laws was to encourage people. Many people were refusing to populate church and nonprofit boards because of the fear of liability. So these laws swept across the country several years ago. And now I think every state has. There's also the Federal Volunteer Protection Act of 1997, which does the same thing on a federal nationwide level. But these laws provide a limited immunity for uncompensated board members of nonprofit organizations with regard to their ordinary negligence. However, they can still be liable personally for their gross negligence, which generally refers to reckless behavior. All I'm saying is, you better believe that it's very possible, if not likely, that a jury would conclude that it borders on, if it doesn't constitute gross negligence, for a church board or pastoral team to permit gatherings or church services like before the pandemic in violation of these regulations and rules. That could easily be deemed to be gross negligence, and the effect of that would be that those board members that authorize this, approve this, could be personally liable. Secondly, punitive damages. It's the same standard. Gross negligence opens the door for punitive damages against a church or any other entity. Punitive damages are damages a court can assess against you to punish you for reckless conduct. And the key thing is, they're not covered by your church's insurance policies. It violates public policy. So you need to be very careful about reckless conduct that can trigger personal liability for board members, but also punitive damages. And for example, there are other things that would be deemed reckless probably by a court that would open the door to personal liability of boards and punitive damages, such as not having a screening program for youth workers in your church, such as continuing to use 15-passenger vans, such as continuing to use non-compliant cribs in the nursery in violation of the Consumer Protection Agency's. Do you know we have 11 million non-compliant cribs in America today? Can you imagine an infant in your nursery gets strangled in the bedding or in the slats, and you are in violation? That crib was non-compliant. And I just can't even imagine the liability there, but it certainly could be deemed gross negligence. Again, exposing the board to personal liability, exposing the church to punitive damages. You want to avoid that. Not having a cell phone policy for members of the church pastoral team that are chatting on the cell phone while they're driving or texting on the cell phone. That could be deemed gross. So these are some examples of gross negligence you got to be very careful to avoid. Okay, now the second case, our church is subject to COVID-19 restrictions. This was in Nevada. Governor Sisolak enacted a rule, an order that said that churches could not have more than 50 people attending services. There's all kinds of violations of that. But remember what I just said, those 3 points. You got to be careful about violating these laws. And the church in this case pointed out, hey, wait a minute. We've got comparable secular organizations that have been treated more favorably than us, such as casinos, breweries, fitness centers, bowling alleys, and they're comparable, and they're being treated more leniently than churches. That went up to the Supreme Court, and the court refused to even respond to that argument. They issued a one-sentence ruling rejecting the church's position. And I like this quote from Justice Alito, who is one of the dissenting opinions. Both of these cases involve 5-4 decisions by the Supreme Court, with John Roberts, the Chief Justice, on the side of the majority. Here's what Justice Gorsuch said this in his dissenting opinion. The world we inhabit today, with the pandemic upon us, poses unusual challenges, but there is no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's Palace over Calvary Chapel. I love it. So there you go. Now let's take a look at another case here. Case number 3, Title VII sex discrimination ban. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the premier civil rights legislation in American history, enacted in 1964. It prohibits employers, which are defined as employers with 15 or more employees involved in interstate commerce, from discriminating in any employment decision, hiring, firing, promotion, demotion, discipline, fringe benefits, etc., on the basis of these 5 categories: race, color, national origin, sex, or religion. The question that's arisen in recent years is, what does sex mean? And does it include sexual orientation? Of course, that wasn't in the minds of the drafters of the Civil Rights Act back in 1964, but a growing number of federal courts have said that it does, that the Constitution needs to be elastic. It needs to be malleable. It needs to adapt and be flexible to new situations. You know, I thought about going into the bank with my mortgage documents and saying, I demand that we renegotiate this. This is a living, breathing document. You know, well, I'd be laughed out of the bank. But we do the same thing with regard to judicial interpretation of the Constitution. Anyway, that's just an aside. So does the word sex in Title VII include sexual orientation? The Supreme Court a few weeks ago ruled that it does, but there are exceptions. For example, ministers are a special case. You can discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity with regard to pastoral positions, no question about it. Religious organizations and religious schools can discriminate. The Amos case in 1987, the Supreme Court ruled that Title VII's ban on discrimination by employers, there's an exception for religious corporations or educational institutions with respect to employment of individuals of a particular religion to perform work connected with carrying on by such corporation or of its activities. So some argued back in the 80s and 70s that, well, that's true for clergy, but it's not for lay employees, janitors, office staff, bookkeepers, etc. It shouldn't apply to them. Well, the Supreme Court ruled, I think it was an 8-to-1 decision, that yes, churches, this section of Title VII was constitutional, and churches can discriminate in so-called secular versus religious positions on the basis of their religious beliefs. Now, you got to be careful here, because what does that mean? This is very important. The court said that religious organizations can discriminate on the basis of religion in their employment decisions. Now, what this means is that it's very important for churches that are going to discriminate against an employee, terminate, discipline, etc., that you clearly articulate the reason for what you're doing. And let me give you an example. There was a famous case in California a number of years ago where a church fired a young woman who was single, unmarried, but pregnant, and they fired her, and they said because of pregnancy. Ah, that's terrible. They didn't word their rationale. They didn't really mean that, but so she went to the EEOC, and there was going to be a big civil rights litigation over this, and you know, so the question was, why was she terminated? So the church board revisited this issue, and they said, well, they told the EEOC, we actually didn't fire her for pregnancy. We fired her for adultery or for sexual misconduct outside of marriage in violation of our religious beliefs. And a federal judge said, well, if that's true, then I dismiss the case. But if you fired her because she's pregnant, this case goes forward. What does that mean? It means you've got to be careful in how you articulate your employment decisions. So if you're going to fire somebody for, like in that case, if you have a pregnant single woman and that violates your church's employment standards, and you're going to fire that person, you've got, don't say pregnancy. You know, I recommend you quote the scriptures upon which you base your decision, that we terminated her for the following, based on our biblical interpretation of numerous verses of scripture, including the following. And make it clear beyond any doubt that you are doing this on the basis of doctrinal positions. Very important. The fourth case, yeah, this was unbelievable. 5 cases in the last 2 months from the US Supreme Court directly involving religious organizations. I've written articles on all of them, and they're on my website, churchlawandtax.com. But anyway, here's the case number 4, the ministerial exception revisit. Now, what's the ministerial exception? This is a very important principle that was recognized by the United States Supreme Court in 2012 in the Hosanna Tabor case in a unanimous ruling. Cite me another case in the last decade where the Supreme Court has had a unanimous opinion on anything. They did in this case. And what was the case about? It was a church in Michigan that terminated a female employee, and she filed a lawsuit claiming discrimination against her based on her disability in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So but the church argued, no, it was because she did not fulfill her duties adequately. And as a teacher in a parochial church-related elementary school, we have high expectations of their behavior, of their conduct. They're models of Christian living to our students and staff. And we felt she fell short. So the Supreme Court said that the ministerial exception prohibits the civil courts from insinuating themselves into and resolving employment disputes, discrimination disputes involving ministers, which they defined to include a teacher in a parochial school, even though she was not, well, in fact, she had a credential as a teacher, but she got a housing allowance. So how do you square that? So anyway, that was a very important case. I want to say it was reaffirmed by the Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision just a couple of weeks ago in the Our Lady of Guadalupe School. There was actually 2 cases, but it gave a robust reaffirmation of the ministerial exception and concluded in both of these cases that a teacher in a parochial elementary school is fulfilling a ministerial duty or activity, and the ministerial exception applies. Now, the last and 5th case I want to mention is the Espinosa case in Montana. This case involved the state of Montana that has a no aid provision in its constitution. No aid, no public funds can be used for religious organizations, period. Well, the legislature enacted a law giving $150 credit to parents sending their kids to a private school, which included, not necessarily limited to, but included secular and religious schools. Oh, well, that was intolerable. We can't have that. So it was immediately challenged. And the Supreme Court, in a closely watched case just a few weeks ago, in a 5-4 decision, said that the court said that this Montana statute did not violate the Constitution. Now, here's what the court said. Montana's no aid provision bars religious schools from public benefits solely because of the religious character of the schools. The provision also bars parents who wish to send their children to a religious school from those same benefits, again, solely because of the religious character of the school. The provision plainly excludes schools from the government aid solely because of religious status, just as in Trinity Lutheran. Now, what was Trinity Lutheran? That was a case decided by the US Supreme Court just a few years ago involving a Missouri law that provided reconstituted tires into a playground surface that was provided to private schools around the state at no charge. Any private school qualified except church operated schools. The court said the free exercise clause protects against even indirect coercion, and a state punishes the free exercise of religion by disqualifying the religious from government aid, as Montana did. Here's what the court said in that Missouri case. The Constitution condemns discrimination against religious schools and the families whose children attend them. They are members of the community too, and their exclusion from the scholarship program here is odious to our Constitution and cannot stand. That's powerful. It opens the door potentially to a renaissance in this country of private education. By the way, I like that word odious. It's odious to our Constitution what Montana did, what Missouri did. Every school qualifies unless you're church related. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being church related? Why is that odious? And so the word odious comes from a Latin word. I studied 4 years of Latin in high school, and it's interesting that it applied to these small buildings around the Roman Empire. And I think Marcus Aurelius built many of them, the great emperor. And this is where people could go in and poetry would be recited. So these are like poetry facilities. They're very small, but they were scattered all over the empire. And they were given the word odia. And that's the word that we use for odious, which means reprehensible, horrible. It's not the way most people view poetry today. So anyway, Erika mentioned this before. I got a few extra minutes here, so I'll just make a few other comments. Electronic meetings of board. I was inundated with calls several months ago, all the way up through today. How are we going to have our church board meetings? What about our church annual membership meeting? How can we do this? What about denominations having membership meetings that are mandated by your governing documents to have these meetings, but we can't meet because of these legal restrictions? And Erika mentioned this first one. Check your governing documents. Do they permit electronic meetings? If they don't, you need to amend them to make sure that that is permitted. Number two, if it's not in your governing documents, get it in there, and also check out your nonprofit corporation law, as I did in my state of Missouri. I couldn't believe it. 900 sections in the nonprofit corporation law. I stumbled upon one little known, probably no judge had ever seen it, but I found it in there. And it gave nonprofit organizations incorporated under that statute the ability to enact emergency bylaws. Look at and to invoke the assistance of a local court to permit flexibility in your governing documents. Here's what it says. Chapter 355.081 of the Missouri statutes provides, if for any reason it is impractical or impossible for any corporation to call or conduct a meeting of its members or directors or otherwise obtain their consent in the manner prescribed by your governing documents, then upon the petition of a single director or officer or member, the court of the county where the corporation has its principal place of business may order that such a meeting be called or a written ballot or other form obtaining the vote of members or delegates or directors be authorized in such manner as the court finds fair and equitable under the circumstances. I guarantee you no judge even knows this exists. And so you put something in front of the judge, they're going to sign it. So this is, I've checked many state nonprofit corporation laws. They all have provisions similar to this. So check your state, if you're a corporation, check your nonprofit corporation law under which you are incorporated and see where, if you have, I guarantee you, most of you are going to find that we have it. And then here's something else I found. Unless the articles of incorporation provide otherwise, the directors of a corporation may adopt, amend, or repeal bylaws to be effective only in an emergency, as defined later. The emergency bylaws, which are subject to amendment or repeal by the members, may provide special procedures for managing the corporation during the emergency, including how to call a meeting of the board, what are the quorum requirements, and designation of additional or substitute directors. So legislatures have provided some significant relief in the context of nonprofit corporations, but this is little known. Many churches are floundering and struggling because they don't know that they have this provision available to them under their nonprofit corporation statute. So check that out. Number 3, by the way, it may take you a while, like me, going through almost 900 sections. Just grab a cup of coffee, have your lunch, have a sandwich, and just enjoy yourself for a few hours. Okay, and then, well, what about Robert's Rules? Did you know Robert's Rules has just come out with its 12th edition? This is it right here. I just got it last week. I'm a registered parliamentarian. There's 250 of us in the United States. So I know something about parliamentary procedure. But by the way, get the spiral bound version if you're going to get this from the National Association of Parliamentarians. It's so easy to lay it on a desk and you're not constantly trying to press it down. So there it is. I've done a quick review and I've isolated about 40 significant changes. I'll be doing an article on this. The 11th edition, which came out 10 years ago, had 153 changes I identified. And I was working on an article on the correlation between the 153 changes and the 153 fish that Peter caught when he threw his net on the other side of the boat in the Sea of Galilee. So I never have been able to figure out a clear connection between those two. But anyway, you select Robert's Rules as your parliamentary authority in your bylaws. It always refers, like it says here at the top, the only current authorized edition of Robert's Rules. This is it. It's not some prior edition that you've just had laying around the church for 20 years. This is what governs your meetings and your business. So be sure you have the current version and are somewhat familiar with it. But Robert's Rule says, except as authorized in the bylaws, the business of an organization or board can be validly transacted only at a regular or properly called meeting that is a single official gathering in one room or area of the assembly of its members at which a quorum is present. So you've got to authorize this in your bylaws, otherwise Robert's Rules would prohibit it. Now, I've got 2 minutes, so I've added a couple of cases here that I thought you might find interesting. Case number 1, this is unbelievable. A federal appeals court ruled that a Hebrew school, a Jewish school in Connecticut, that had a teacher who was a rabbi, that over a couple of years sexually molested a high school student in that school. The student, as an adult, sued the rabbi and the school, received a $21.7 million verdict. Immediately, the school appealed, said that's excessive. Excessive verdicts can be reversed on appeal, or through a remittiture, they can be reduced by the court. But the court, the federal appeals court in this case, said that that $21.7 million verdict was not excessive. That's the highest verdict I've ever seen for the sexual molestation of a minor in a religious organization. That was 15 million compensatory damages, 5 million punitive, 1.7 million interest. So what does this mean? It just underscores the importance of your church having a robust procedure for vetting the people that are going to be working with children and minors in your church. It's so important, and here is a classical reason why. We can do better. The next case, California case involving a public school district, but it applies equally to churches. That a public school was liable for an incident of child molestation, but there's a number of things the court concluded that I thought were interesting. Number 2, the school should have asked the defendant about the 13-year period in which he stated he was self-employed. Number 4, school policy should address communications between teachers and students. This is very important. I've taught a 5th grade Sunday school class for 35 years in my church and a high school mentoring class for about 4 years now. I would never communicate with any of those kids by any medium, social media of any kind. And I think it's important for you to really make youth and children's workers, including children's pastors and youth pastors, aware that the church does not permit this. Contact your local public school district and find out what is their policy on teachers fraternizing or communicating with minors. And in my community, it's prohibited. And that's your cover if you need it. Very important. Increased supervision was number 8. Prior conviction for DWI was not a disqualifying crime. So you do these criminal records checks. What are you going to do with the crime? Like in this case, in one case, some guy was convicted of resisting arrest. Well, does that disqualify you from working with children? Well, look at what the state, in this case, the court said, you just look at the state law for educational institutions. Every public school has to do criminal records checks on people that are going to be, that are employees of the school. And what crimes are disqualifying under your state law? If you find that list, that's your roadmap. You don't permit those people, you have the same standards, in other words. And if you do that, you're likening your system to the public schools, and it's a tremendous defense. Just a couple other points here in conclusion. Number 9, and this is important, anonymous tips can constitute a reasonable basis to believe a minor is being abused, triggering a duty to report. You don't ignore anonymous tips. That's the bottom line here. If they provide credible, tangible information that can be followed up on by you. Case number 3, a religious marriage was not a legal marriage and therefore did not cut off the former husband's obligation to pay alimony. Very important. I get this question a lot. And finally, the FF case in New York. New York amended a statute which required children to be vaccinated before entering school and removed the previous religious exemption. This did not violate the free exercise of religion clause because it was facially neutral and not enacted for the purpose of targeting religious believers. The court said the right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to communicable disease or the latter to ill health or death. Amen. Well, Erika, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Rich. I heard you say amen, so that was definitely my cue. All that you shared with our audience today. I'm going to see if we can slip in one of the questions that we received, the first question that we received. There are several in the chat, but we'll do this one, and hopefully we can get to some more at the Q&A period. So this question asks for Richard, do we need to check temperatures at the door for people attending services and classes?
Here's the perfect answer to that question. Contact your local health agency and ask that question. If your behavior, if your conduct, if your protocols and procedures mirror what the government health agencies have mandated, even if it's not mandated, get their opinion. What should we do? You know, the infrared temperature thermometers when people, it's so simple to do. You go to a doctor's office now. There are many venues where that happens. My church does. And but if you base your decision on these questions to what the health agency tells you, that is you don't have to worry about it. We'll just do what they tell us, and I think you'll find differences of opinion on that.
Fantastic. Thanks for your response there. And again, we will try to have time for the Q&A shortly. Richard, thank you so much for your presentation on the 2020 legal update for churches. As always, very timely and very helpful. I appreciate it.
I got to go catch a plane to Bismarck.
Well, we'll catch you in 2.5 days.
Okay.
All right, now we're going to move into our panel. So our panel presentation, you will hear from 3 presenters. Our first is going to be Dr. Bobby Manning. Dr. Bobby Manning is the senior pastor at First Baptist Church of District Heights. Under his leadership, the church has grown significantly in number as well as local and global impact. Dr. Manning leads his community in continued service to the physical and spiritual needs of the residents and will speak on the topic of racial reconciliation. Thank you so much, Dr. Manning. Did I filibuster? There you are. How's it going? Good to see you.
Good morning. Good to see everybody today.
Take it
Well,
away.
what an honor it is to be with you all today, and thankful for Erika and for Aronson LLC and Whiteford, Taylor Preston. Grateful for the opportunity to spend these few minutes with you all talking about the concept, an important concept in my opinion, of racial reconciliation within the church. Of course, there are so many things happening in our country surrounding things in the news, things that affect us directly as faith institutions, as well as institutions of law. And so I'm very excited and a little bit nervous because I want to make sure that I maximize the time that we have to share together today. A little bit about me from the beginning. I'm a pastor of a church in District Heights, Maryland, that has a rich history of bridging racial divides. The church was planted in 1952 by Anglo missionaries from the South. And as District Heights, the city changed in the early 80s, the church changed shortly thereafter. Long story short, that what that amounts to is I am the first Black pastor of our church and serve, however, in a predominantly white denomination. And so I've had my fair share, I could say, of frustrating, discouraging, but also encouraging and forward-moving conversations about racial reconciliation. Having written a couple of books about the engagement of people of color in our country, I often get asked the questions, the difficult but also important questions of how do we bridge racial divides within our churches, within our church organizations, and across racial lines as we try our best to be reflections of a biblical standard of unity and love for our neighbors and for one another. This is obviously a conversation that we can have, folks, all day long. But for the interest of time, I think there are 3 principles that I would like to share with you all and hopefully spark some conversation. And so the first principle I want to encourage for all of us as we seek, as we embrace the uncomfortable, and we certainly push towards what we all deem as racial reconciliation, although we may often have different definitions of those terms. We'll talk about that in a moment. But here's one principle. The first principle I want to share is that we should acknowledge racial disparities and commit to destroying them. Folks, we can't have racial reconciliation if we're still pretending that racism is something that Black people have overblown, or that people of color have overblown or need to get over, something that was decades ago and therefore has no impact on today's society, or something that doesn't affect us. Honestly, the definition, in my opinion, of privilege is concluding that something is not a problem simply because it's not a problem for me. And so I think the first steps to racial reconciliation is concluding that maybe the problem isn't them, maybe the problem is me, and the commitment that I make personally to acknowledging racial disparities, and the commitment that I make to tearing down the racial disparities that do exist. In my opinion, folks, that's a responsibility, a gospel responsibility for those of us who are church leaders. I've heard oftentimes that that acknowledging and destroying racial disparities is not a gospel issue, that we in the country don't have a skin problem, we have a sin problem, and the goal is just to get everybody saved. Now, I'm a preacher, I'm a pastor, and my message is every Sunday is that that forgiveness and eternity is available through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. That to me is the gospel. But I also, not but, and I also believe that the gospel is bigger than just making sure that everybody goes to heaven. I believe that the gospel includes both why Jesus died, but also why Jesus lived. We know why Jesus died. Jesus died as a substitutionary sacrifice for our sins, so that our sins, yours and mine, can be covered and forgiven, that we can have access to God the Father, and that we could have eternity with him forever. That is why Jesus died. But Jesus also made abundantly clear while he was on earth why he lived. And I believe that the gospel is as much about why Jesus lived as it is why Jesus died. When in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus announces the beginning of his ministry here on earth, he's in the synagogue and he opens the scroll of Isaiah. And folks, he could have picked any scripture out of Isaiah to read to announce the beginning of his ministry. He could have picked the scripture in Isaiah that speaks of the birth of Christ, who now unto us a child is born and a son is given, and the government shall be on his shoulders, and by his stripes we shall be. He was that it speaks of his birth. Or he could have gone to the place in Isaiah where it speaks of the fact that he be the sacrificial lamb, wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. But that's not the scripture he goes to. He goes to the scripture in Isaiah that says, I'm here to proclaim liberty to the captives and to preach the good news to the poor. That Jesus not only died for our sins, but he lived to reach people who are marginalized and oppressed. And that's exactly what he did in his earthly ministry. And I believe our responsibility is to mimic Jesus in this, that the goal is always an eternity with God. But right now, the ministry goes to those who are oppressed and marginalized. And in our country, if we are students of history, we must recognize and understand that does include people of color and other marginalized groups. And it's our gospel responsibility to dig into this. I'm reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King's book, his letters from a Birmingham jail. That is easy to remember his dream speech, but Dr. King was very, very poignant about the responsibility of all of us clergy members, those of us who are bearers of the cross and bearers of the gospel, to participate in this ongoing struggle. So my first encouragement is to acknowledge the racial disparities and commit to destroying them. My second encouragement is don't form opinions until you form relationships. Folks, having such conversations, that we have to have conversations with people who see the world differently than we do. Unfortunately, a lot of times what we do, especially on social media, is we share our ideas and our thoughts in an echo chamber of people who already think the same way that we do, people who will already agree with our perspectives because they're from the same background. The problem, folks, is that my way of seeing the world is only one way of seeing the world. And all of us have blind spots. And so we have to have some tough conversations with people who don't look like us, who don't come from the same background, who don't think like us, maybe don't even vote like us, and may have different reasons, maybe even gospel reasons to vote differently than I do. The problem is if I conclude what I think about that person, or conclude what I think about that position before I have a conversation with that person about that conviction, then I am selling myself short. Y'all, having such conversations may not change my mind, but it may broaden my perspective. It may not make me feel the way someone else feels. but it may help me understand why they feel that way. A great scholar in this discussion and a friend of mine, Brian Loritz, says something like this: if you don't have proximity, you will lack empathy. And so it's important, folks, that we don't form opinions until we form relationships. My third and final encouragement to you as my time winds down is that we should know our terms. Folks, you know as well as I do that we have this tendency of tossing around words like we know what they mean. But it's so important that we understand the meaning and the energy behind the words that we use. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 18 says, there is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. It's so important that we're mindful of what we do with our mouth, that we tame our tongue, which means, folks, we have to know the meaning of our words and the impact of our words. The meaning of our words, y'all, we have to be responsible enough to go to original sources to define our terms. Rather than listening to your favorite media outlet or your favorite blogger or your favorite podcaster define a term for you that they don't even identify with, or to define a term for you that they disagree with, maybe we should go to the original sources, because I've seen so many terms being misused and bandied about as pejoratives rather than understood so that we can understand each other. Terms like white privilege, terms like critical race theory, terms like cultural Marxism, even terms like woke are being tossed about in ways that are pejorative, and ascribed to people who do not ascribe to these philosophies if are identified properly. But we often don't know what words mean when we use them. We have to go once again go to the original sources of the terms that we use so that we can make sure that we're using the terms properly. And then, of course, we got to understand the impact of our words. In a time of social media, I think it's very, very easy to toss words out into the world and not understand how they impact people. That taming our tongue in 2020 is now extended to our thumbs and what we type and what we say, particularly on social media. But the scriptures are clear about the responsibility of a believer and how we use our words. Proverbs 12 is one example of that. We just read Proverbs 12:18. That your tongue can be a sword or it can be a scalpel. A sword is an instrument of death. A scalpel is an instrument of health. But it just depends on how you use your tongue. And we must understand the impact of our words, what we say and how we say it, and the fact that we as Christians, as believers, as church leaders, represent Christ everywhere we go and everything we say. And so my encouragement for all of us, I know this is an uncomfortable conversation, but we do ourselves no favors by avoiding the conversations, or by mistreating these conversations, or by downplaying the importance or the impact of these conversations. Let's together embrace the uncomfortable by acknowledging the racial disparities and committing to destroy them, by not forming opinions until we form relationships, and by knowing our terms, the meaning of our words, and the impact of our words. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you today at this great conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manning. You have given us so much to think about in embracing the uncomfortable, and maybe becoming more uncomfortable is the first step to
Absolutely.
racial reconciliation, as you shared those 3 points with us. I heard the preacher coming out for sure, and I'm going to be working on taming my thumb. That was good, taming our thumb.
Amen.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
All right, you will next hear from on our panel Azuna Anyanwu. He is the Director of IT at Aronson LLC. With 20 years of experience in IT operations and strategy, cybersecurity, and business process reengineering, he will speak on virtual reality, how current circumstances require a heightened online presence. Thank you so much, Azuna. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Erika. So good morning, still morning at this time. Thank you for introduction. I will talk. Let me go ahead and see if I can control the screen. Good. So a little bit about me. As Erika introduced me, I am the Director of Information Technology for Aronson LLC. I'm also responsible for our technology cyber risk advisory practice that we provide to clients. Personally, I'm a Kingdom citizen. I'm a husband, 13 years. I'm a father of 3. I'm a ministry partner, so I actually am part of a local ministry with multiple locations in the DC metro area, where I actually serve as the director of the technology ministry there. Professionally, there are series of words that kind of describe me or that I use to describe myself, I'd say. The first one is really technology advisor. I've spent 20 plus years advising clients, federal government, state government, private enterprises, in terms of, IT operations, IT strategy, IT cybersecurity, just because, this is my calling in life, if you will. And I think that, this platform, even that we're on, being on a virtual platform, we'd ordinarily have this conference in person, is an indication of kind of the changing times that we're facing and why this subject is, particularly important. So during this pandemic, one of the things that you may not be aware of is that malicious actors are very hard at work, right? They're not unemployed, they're not furloughed, they're not looking for, they actually are looking for opportunities. And so I thought this scripture reference is just as applicable to the kingdom of God as it is to the cybersecurity world, which is that the thief only comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. Now, I'm not Jesus, definitely don't profess to be that, but I am here to provide some information so that you're not ignorant of, the adversary's devices, and that, frankly, your ministry is not one of the ones that, are devoured by the adversary. So talking about virtual reality, how the current circumstances require heightened online presence, I'm actually going to talk about, a couple of different cyber crimes that have really risen in prevalence over this time frame. And then, the problem solver with me, at the end, will give you some suggestions about how I've, advised clients to tackle it, how I've, tackled it for my organization, among others. So one of the most prevalent cybersecurity crimes is ransomware and data theft. It actually evolved, so it started just as ransomware. So the idea behind this, for those that are not aware, is that a criminal will get into your system. They will encrypt it with, some sort of password that you don't have access to. They will send you information asking you to pay a ransom in order to release your data. That ransom is normally paid in some, untraceable currency like Bitcoin. And then, so there's been a rise of prevalence over that. They've evolved actually into data theft, because now they've figured out some companies actually are choosing not to pay the ransom. They've put protective measures in place. They may not have the means to do it, and are saying, maybe we'll just start from scratch. And so what the criminals have done is evolve their method of operating to now include data breaches and extortion. So if you won't pay the ransom, they'll put it publicly on the internet, right, and expose all your your emails and things of that nature, or they'll actually sell that data to kind of the highest bidder. You may think this is something that only applies to enterprises that are large, right? So, the large multinationals, the larger firms. The reality is that the average size of a firm that's targeted by ransomware is just 62 people. I'm pretty sure most of the ministries that are on this call have more than 62 members in their organization, or more than 60 people that are part of their IT kind of infrastructure, right? So all the ministry workers and volunteers and everybody that has an email on there. The average ransomware payment is over $100,000. I was actually listening to a webinar a couple of days ago, and the first multi-million-dollar ransomware payment was demanded, right? Over $2 million, if I remember correctly. And in reality is that, ransomware is really disruptive, right? Can your ministry operations survive a couple of weeks of downtime, right? The average is 15 days, where you don't have access to your emails, you don't have access to your website, you don't have access to your giving tools or your financial records and things of that nature. The other crime that is really prevalent is business email compromise. It used to have a, it's also known as the CEO fraud. It's actually evolved significantly beyond that. I'm not going to bother reading the FBI definition for that, but at a high level, it's a scam that targets ministries and businesses that regularly perform, wire transfers. The reality is that in 2019 alone, there was a $26 billion loss as a result of business email compromise scams, right? So attackers getting into companies' systems, getting into ministry systems, and directing people to do things that they, should not have ordinarily done. We've not seen the 2020 numbers, but that $26 billion actually represented a 100% increase over 2018. I mentioned earlier that the name business email compromise when it first came out was referring to like CEO fraud. What the reality is that the hackers have evolved their techniques and they realize, well, we don't have to attack the CEO. We need to attack the person who handles the money. So there's actually been an 87% increase in phishing campaigns that target like finance staff, within an organization. There's been a 75% increase targeting, those that are dealing with invoice fraud. And churches are not immune to this. So here's an article, if I recall correctly, this was from 2019, so this is about a year ago, but a Brunswick church fell for a phishing scam of almost $2 million, $1.7 million, give or take. They were in the middle of a building project. Somebody got into their email system and directed them to make payments to what they thought was their builder, and it turned out to be a bad actor. And, unfortunately, that money was long gone, by the time they discovered, right? Because the builder eventually said, hey, you haven't paid us in a few months. And then they realized, what the issue was. So, what are some of the common, financial scam techniques? Payroll diversion and invoice fraud are two of the more common ones. Payroll diversion. So either the hackers will get into, if you have like a self-service portal for employees, they'll get into that portal and they'll change the account to account that they control and have the payroll go there, or they will imitate the employee and send a request to the HR department asking for a change to direct deposit accounts. Or invoice fraud, I just referred to that with the example with the church, for example, where they spoof an email from a vendor or supplier. They tell you that there's a change in the banking information, right? They send a note saying that it's from the pastor or from the leader authorizing some payment to be done. And you'd be surprised because you may be sitting here and thinking, well, this seems silly, but the reality is that these attacks are actually very effective and they're actually fairly simple to kind of pull off. So how do we prevent, breaches, and how do we secure ministries' resources? And I've got a little highlight here that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between the ministry workers, the volunteers, the people essentially that make up the practice, as well as people like myself who kind of function in IT space. But to emphasize my point, I'm actually going to kind of tell a bit of a story. So I was watching Pastor Stephen Furtick on TV, and he was sharing the story. He was on a business trip. On that trip with him was his essentially chief financial officer, head of his finance controller, head of his finance ministry, and he had a need to authorize a payment to have some funds be moved. And he asked the individual who's with him to go ahead and initiate that query. And that individual called his assistant back at the ministry and said, hey, pastor just told me we need to move this funds, or we need to make this payment, or things of that nature. And I found the response of the individual who was called to be telling. And they said, okay, thank you, right? This is somebody that you work with on a daily basis. You're getting a call, you're getting an instruction, right? The pastor said, and his response was, well, we have a process by which we follow, and so we're going to follow it. And so that's actually where, I would say we need to start in terms of, preventing data breaches is, do you have established policies and procedures within your organization? Do you have a method by which, you have controls that are in place for some of these kinds of things? If somebody were to direct a member of your staff to wire payment to somebody else or to pay a vendor that is not normal, do you have checks and balances in your system that are in place to prevent these kinds of things from happening? Because the truth of the matter is that is actually how we address cybersecurity. It needs to be a holistic kind of effort. Many organizations, many vendors, frankly, will go out and try to sell you on tools. I actually like to start with the people side. Have you provided security awareness training to your people? Have you made them aware of what their responsibilities are as it relates to cybersecurity? Have you made sure that they understand, how to spot a phishing scam, how to report that scam to the organization? From a process perspective, right? Do you have a security program? Have you developed a security program? Do you have an idea of how you actually want to secure ministry assets? Do you know what vulnerabilities exist in your environment? Do you know what risks that that exist within your environment? So develop a formalized security program and then test it. Test and test often, right? Conduct independent security assessments. They go by various names. You can have a penetration test done against your environment. You can have a vulnerability scan done against your environment. I'd actually highly recommend some sort of continuous monitoring so that you have a service that will alert you to, hey, it's the middle of the night and somebody's logging in from Thailand into, the pastor's computer. Why is that? So do you have those things in place? And then last but not the least, absolutely, the security tools are important. The security tools have a place, but what I don't want is for you to overly emphasize those tools comparatively. So given the environment, a lot of ministry workers are actually remote for the first time. Instead of being in the ministry and being into the office, they're working from home. So provide some guidance to them. So for example, on their home computers or work computers, make sure antivirus is up to date. Make sure the operating system updates are happening on a regular basis. Microsoft puts out updates. Many people are Windows. Mac does the same thing. Apple does the same thing. And so make sure those updates are being properly applied, both to the servers. For your employees, know where they're working from, know where they're coming from. I used that example earlier of the example of somebody logging into the ministry's computer late at night from a foreign country, right? Do you know where your people are kind of coming from? And so encourage them, help them, right? It's the new normal, right? So normally I wouldn't be responsible or wouldn't help with home computers and things of that nature. But given the environment that we're living in right now, it's critically important that I assist our people to be able to perform effectively wherever they are. And then last but not the least, ministry systems, make sure you're using those, for email, for messaging, for ministry work, right? So the days of everybody coming with their own AOL account or Gmail account, hopefully are over, because it's a lot harder to control. Use things like virtual private networks when you're connecting to a third-party network, when you're at Starbucks or when you're at a hotel Wi-Fi. I'll leave with a couple of resources. The Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, is actually a good resource. Unfortunately, just have it in the back of your mind, right? The expression is that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a cybersecurity vulnerability or compromise or may occur. And that's actually where you go and report that. They actually have a rapid response team, a rapid assistance team, if I remember correctly. And so, for example, if you find yourself subject to, one of those business email, fraud schemes, and you've wired a payment to somebody that you shouldn't have sent it to, call them immediately. They've got like a 24 to 48 hour turnaround in which they've actually have a fairly high timing for them to be able to recover those funds. Beyond that, unfortunately, like I said, it just doesn't happen. And then the U.S. CERT, the Computer Emergency Readiness Team, if I remember correctly, provides a lot of guidance. I laid 3 specific ones just related to this topic that we're talking about today. So around ransomware and social engineering and malicious code. Last but not the least, I'll leave you with some best practices. So the Department of Defense has instituted this new cybersecurity maturity model. I recognize that we're not DoD contractors here, but I found it to be very easy to follow. There's literally 17 things that they recommend that organizations do as a baseline cybersecurity hygiene. Things like use strong passwords. I'll give you a hint. An 8-character password can be cracked, even if it has uppercase, lowercase numbers, and special characters. It can be cracked in 8 hours or less. So 8 characters is just not enough. So use strong passwords. Don't use shared logins. I recognize that this is challenging for ministries where you have a blah ministry or drama team or whatever it is, and everybody has a login. Well, now you don't know who did what or where it might have been compromised or things of that nature. So every person should have their own account. Install updates regularly. You'd be surprised, even large corporations fail and fall to this, where they don't, install updates on a regular basis. So again, I hope you found this helpful. Just really being aware of what the vulnerabilities are that are out there, and the fact that, as I mentioned in the beginning, the malicious actors, they're now sleeping. Thank you.
Azuna, thank you so much for what you've shared on how current circumstances require a heightened online presence. I appreciate the best practices as well. I like the idea of being able to check through those things for good cyber hygiene, I guess as you say. So thank you so much for what you shared with everyone. So lastly, we'll hear from, on the panel today, we'll hear from Mitch Lustig. He is the Executive Vice President of the PMM company. PMM has grown into one of the largest janitorial services, disinfection, and facilities maintenance and management companies in the greater DC area. And Mitch will be speaking about how to protect your house of worship. Mitch, over to you.
Thank you.
We saw you for a second and then you disappeared. There you go.
It disappeared. Thank you, Erika. I really appreciate it. I appreciate being invited to the Church Law and Finance 2020 conference. In my presentation, I'll provide a contextual review for reopening, such as the different types of cleaning processes, equipment, proper protocol, and the proper communication necessary for developing a dynamic and safe cleaning program in your buildings. Okay, the slides aren't going. I may need a manual. There we go. Thank you. Okay, where are we today? Well, the local jurisdictions are really controlling how we open. We don't know how the stages are going to be in the fall and the winter. We're hopeful for a happy state of affairs, but at any time we could be closed up. The CDC provides tremendous guidance for us and the technical assistance consistent with the needs and beliefs of each community, each religious community. But ultimately, the CDC provides guidance and the local jurisdictions really decide whether we're going to stay open or not. Key considerations, safety first. I'll get back to that a little later. The roles of each house of worship, churches. Each building, whether small, medium, or large, has a tremendous amount of usage, worship and fellowship, daycare, religious, special events. There's a multitude of things that go on. We need to customize an approach for each building, or for each part of the building. Labor is going to be the key here. In depressed times economically, we need to allocate the best resource. And I just want to say everything that I'm talking about can be for outsourced services or in-house. They just need to be adjusted. Preparing for reentry and ongoing occupancy. Well, the main thing is when the building is going to be open. That's a decision by the local jurisdictions and the decision makers in your organization. That's passed down to the facilities manager, the subcontractor, the business manager, and disseminated to the congregation and to the staff. We need to make sure we have the appropriate safeguards, the temperature checks, the masks, the washing of hands. Communication, I've sat on several task force. People want to know what's going on. They want to know what you're doing, and they're entitled to that as visitors or members of a congregation. We need to tailor the cleaning and disinfection, the scope of work. We'll talk a greater length of that to better serve your building. We all know that COVID can be spread from different ways. The CDC changes that somewhat constantly. Some is airborne and some is through contaminated surfaces. My discussion is really how to curtail this through the use of contaminated surfaces. There's a wide range of associations and groups that are putting out some great stuff. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. The information's out there. The CDC has provided guidance specifically for houses of worship, and there's many other organizations that have. We just need to be implementers. At the bottom, you'll see the GBAC trained technician. This is for in-house people who may not have the expertise. They may want to send somebody to one of these classes to become an expert because this environment requires some expertise. Cleaning terms, what do they really mean? Well, you see the bookends, cleaning and disinfecting. We've done cleaning for years. We'll continue to do cleaning in the buildings. Disinfecting is the big variable. Prior to COVID, we would disinfect restrooms, eating areas, and was mostly cleaning. What we know that kills the COVID virus is disinfecting. It's aggressive. Some of the challenges with the disinfecting is the cure time. It takes between 1 and 5 minutes for it to work. I see many people not letting the chemical work for them. That's a training issue. So you need to be conscious of that. But it does kill the germs and the viruses. Be careful on your special finishes, and especially your wood church pews. Disinfectants can degrade these finishes. There are special products out there to use. So be conscious of that. Sanitizing reduces the germs. It does not kill viruses. It reduces bacteria. And there are some things highlighted that you can look into. Cleaning jargon. There's high touch points. You'll hear a lot about that. Look at that as things that everybody touches. Doorknobs, phones, elevator call buttons. Those need to be disinfected on a regular basis. Hopefully you're all using green chemicals. There's a lot of harsh chemicals out there that are not green. And with the amount of cleaning, we have to be conscious of keeping things non-toxic. Electrostatic spraying. That's a key takeaway for in-house or outsource. That is actually disinfecting with the machine. I'll go into that later. And then using the EPA disinfectants, which are on the N list. If you have any questions, please check that list. Electrostatic spraying. Electrostatic spraying can be a handheld or a backpack unit that has a disinfectant that kills the COVID virus on contact. The great thing about it is that you can do large spaces. It's very effective. You do need some training. It can degrade paper surfaces and also computers if not done in a proper setting. The nice thing is there's no cure time. You spray it and you leave and it's disinfecting. We currently have approximately 100 people who are on this service. For people who are doing work themselves, they may want to purchase a machine. Again, an appropriate PPE and frequency should be determined by space. Prolonged inhibitor application. This is really a chemical that's used that is an inhibitor. It is not a disinfectant. It's used, it's applied by the spraying machine. And look at it as like spikes. When the virus hits the spikes, it's degraded and then eliminated for up to 90 days. Ideally, it's used with electrostatic spraying. This has been used in hospitals for approximately 10 years. Okay, getting prepared for occupancy, real important. You have to determine what parts of the building are going to be used. Obviously, full buildings won't be used all at one time. Some of the religious or the nursery school areas and some of the social halls may not be used. Don't put your resource there. Put it in areas where you're going to be cleaning. Build flexibility into your plan. We don't know how long the virus is going to last, so we have to be flexible. Important, create specific statements of work, scopes of work for each area. For the routine cleaning, the high touch point disinfection. We need to save your labor. If you ask them to clean the building thoroughly every day, you will not have enough resource. So somebody needs to be the general and provide a platform for the people to work effectively. Training. If you're outsourcing, have the janitorial company, they'll be training their own staff. If you're in-house, utilize your suppliers to come in and provide that service. Communicate, communicate, communicate. People want to know what's going on in your building, both visitors, guests, and staff. Okay, you're opened. You take the scopes of work and you go to work. Somebody needs to be monitoring the people that are cleaning to make sure that it's being done properly. This is a new way of doing business. If you're fortunate enough to be large enough to have day staff, they can be wiping down the high touch points during the day. It's very important in addition to their other duties. Things like break rooms, restrooms, meeting rooms will need multiple cleaning during the day and need to be attended to for that. Also the use of electrostatic disinfecting, and if it makes sense, the prolonged inhibitor. Supplies and replenishment. We've all got caught short. You need to go into your supply closets. I've listed the things that I feel are important: the sanitizers, the soaps, the masks. Even if you have some of this stuff, make sure you have plenty. Most of this stuff is on back order, and you need to really get it in your supply closet. Communication, we've all seen it. One of the important ones that I don't see a lot of is identify areas that are closed. We don't want people to walk into areas that aren't being utilized. There's not a lot of staff in the buildings to direct people, so create that signage. You can do that on your own copiers. Emergency services, if there's an outbreak of COVID, I would contract with somebody who is certified. Again, if you're in-house, if you send somebody through the GBAC certification, that would be helpful. The post-cleaning report's imperative, both for communication and potentially litigation in the future. Our experience, why am I here? Well, about 40% of our business is in houses of worship, schools. We're a leader in this industry and know quite a bit about it. We sit on many task forces, not only myself, but members of the executive team. We're a 40-year-old company servicing all of Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Florida. We have over 1,000 employees and 30 million square feet, and we are part of the community. This is how our company started, was with houses of worship, and this is where we feel real comfortable. Key takeaways for today. Ultimately, it's a local decision whether you're going to open up. As things change, you have to be flexible. Cleaning and disinfection plans should be tailored to the multiple uses of the facility. Utilize your staff properly. Have a robust cleaning and disinfection plan in place prior to opening. Prepare, plan, train, reinforce. And then cleaning and disinfection protocols should be based on guidance from regulatory agencies and local authorities. Keep posted. Plan needs to be flexible and mindful of financial impact. We're all hurting in this world. You need to make sure you don't overuse labor and that you use it prudently. And last but not least, if necessary, work with an outsourced provider with domain experience. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Hopefully some of these things were helpful in your own buildings.
Thank you again, Mitch. Certainly helpful, and I love the reference to use of green products. Try to do that at home, and certainly the good thing in this time, as you say, to avoid toxicity. So again, thank you so much. So we're now going to have a Q&A. So Mitch, you can stay on, and if all the other panelists will join at this time, go ahead and mute yourself until and unless you're speaking. But if all the panelists can join, and Richard Hammar, if you're able to join us, that'll be fantastic. If not, we'll certainly look forward to reviewing your data points that you shared. Okay, I see Richard. Everyone, can you make a point to mute yourself? This is really how we do now. All right, so let me take this first question that came in regarding the PPP loan. So the question says, we have 43 churches ready to file to convert their PPP loans to forgiveness. We have heard that the SBA is going to create a simple form for entities whose loans are under 150,000. Hey, Clara, can you mute anything that's not muted? What do you know about this? And we know the rules changed about the timeline for use of PPP funds, as well as the date for applying for forgiveness was extended. What is the current timeline for both of these? Some congregations, PPP lenders say to deal with only their online forgiveness vehicle. Others seem to direct the churches to deal directly with the SBA. Any advice here? It's a long question, but let's see if we can dig into the answer. I will say that the PPP loan obviously has been replete with information and information gaps, and then information fills, and then some changes, and all of it's also probably complicated by the fact that our current political environment and it being an election year and all those things. We have a team though here at the firm that has helped walk through PPP loans, and so this is what has been shared. And I'll give a shout out here to Jordan Halley, who the attorney here who brought this response in very quickly. Many banks are slow rolling their forgiveness process because there has been a lot of talk, including a bipartisan coalition in Congress and pressure from major business and banking groups about permitting automatic forgiveness for loans of less than $150,000 with only an affidavit required. At this time, there is no word on whether or when such legislation will make it through Congress, but many small borrowers are choosing to wait rather than incur the costs and burdens of seeking forgiveness at this time. As far as timing, loans will enter repayment 10 months after the end of the covered period, meaning 10 months plus 24 weeks from the date of funding, or additional 8 weeks if the borrower elected a shorter covered period. If the forgiveness application has been submitted, if the application's been submitted. So there's still a while before borrowers need to submit a forgiveness application. So that answers that part. Finally, to the question of who to speak to, borrowers should speak with their lenders. The SBA will not receive any forgiveness applications directly. They must all be received by the lenders and remitted to the SBA with the lender's decision. So hopefully that gives a thorough response to that extensive question. All right, so let me go to the next question. Rich, I think you may have mentioned the answer to this, but I'm gonna toss out the next two questions to you. The first one I think is probably pretty quick. How do we get a copy of Robert's Rules of Order is the first question to our attorney / CPA / MBA / parliamentarian. So Richard, if you could respond to that. The second question is, can you apply the ministerial exception under FLSA and separate from the IRS ministerial standards to non-ordained ministerial staff? Those questions are directed to you, Rich.
Yes, I generally get parliamentary materials. There are many places you can do it on Amazon, I'm sure, but I usually go through the NAP, the National Association of Parliamentarians. They have a bookstore with really a lot of excellent parliamentary materials. So it probably would be good for you to be acquainted with that resource. And what was the other one, Erika?
Yeah, let me give that question to you in two parts as well. Are churches subject to FLSA? And then the second part is, can you apply the ministerial exception under FLSA and separate from the IRS ministerial standard to non-ordained ministerial staff?
Yes, churches are subject to the FLSA, except for the relationship between clergy and the church. There have been a number of federal court rulings that have said, in fact, the Department of Labor website says that clergy are not subject to FLSA. It's not really definitive because they're not, binding precedent, but that is, it's out there. You can find that for yourself on the DOL website. In my book, Pastor, Church, and Law, it's about 10 pounds. I address that issue in some detail, but with respect to other staff, there's no exception. And I got a good memory. It's just too short. What was that next one?
The next one, I think you already touched on, the ministerial exception under FLSA.
Yes, the ministerial exception has never been applied. I don't recall that has been applied to ministers, to FLSA. It's only been applied to discrimination laws in the employment context, like Title VII. There have been a couple of cases outside of that context, but that's getting removed from what the purpose of the exception is.
All right, thank you so much. This next question is directed to Azuna. Azuna, any advice to us related to the use of cloud services? A good question.
That's a very broad question. So I'm a big fan of cloud services. You know, I don't know the context, and so if you want to kind of follow up, we can kind of do that. But here's what I would say: the cloud providers have specific responsibilities, which normally limit them to the infrastructure and the platform. They promise to have it be available on a regular basis. You are still responsible for protecting your data. So, as an example, people put data on Amazon Web Services, they don't put a password on it, and somebody gets into it. Not Amazon's fault, your fault. But yeah, in general, I am a strong proponent of cloud services. I feel like they're a great equalizer. We're using one of the platforms right now, and have really, enabled technology to kind of go beyond just what any individual company can afford.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
This next question is for Dr. Manning. Dr. Manning, are there any materials, books, etc., that you would recommend for ongoing anti-racism learning?
Absolutely, there are countless resources, but if I could highlight just a couple that I find myself recommending quite a bit. One is a book by Hammar, that's Tisby. The book is called The Color of Compromise. And then another book I recommend is a book called Woke Church by Dr. Eric Mason, Mason, Woke Church. By Dr. Eric Mason, both excellent treatments of how the faith community can appropriately, biblically respond to race issues. It helps to define some of those terms that we were discussing earlier, and does so in a manner that's theologically strong as well.
All right, thank you. This next question wasn't directed to anyone in particular, so I'll just put it out to everyone. We have people in our congregation that refuse to wear masks. What is our responsibility, parentheses, and potential liability, close parentheses, as a church? Do we not let them enter our building? I have a pretty immediate thought on that, but does anybody from our panel want to share your thoughts there?
Like I said before, contact the local health agency and ask them that question. Because if you follow their recommendation, it absolutely reduces your risk. Adults can assume legal risks. And if somebody certainly who is aware of the risk decides to enter church without a mask, it's probable that they have assumed the risk, and that relieves the church from liability. But aside from that, I always recommend, first and foremost, contact the local health department and get an opinion from them.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see. Mitch, I think there's a question. Does Mitch have an officer team in the Baltimore-Harford County area of Maryland? And as a follow-on question, there was a question of whether people will have access to the information, the contact information from everyone on the panel. So I'm going to answer the last part of that question, and Mitch, if you can answer the first part of that. So you will receive an ebook. We prior had provided hard copies, like this was our 2019 resource for attendees. This is our 2018 resource for attendees, and you'll get a downloadable link, as I understand it, with all the resources and all of our contact information. So we definitely will not be able to get through the myriad of questions that we have. I think we have like 70 some questions, I don't know. So we won't be able to answer all of those, but please feel free to follow up with us after today's event. And Mitch, your availability, I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we have an office and a full blown team in Baltimore and Harford County. So we serve all of Maryland. So yes, we would have somebody to talk to. And if I would just throw out there, if people have questions, if they want to, email me, specific, it is a technical thing. I'll do the best I can depending on, how many to do it timely, to answer any questions and to be helpful.
All right, thank you so much. All right, a question that came in for me. Do you have a source or can you provide sample wording for bylaws regarding virtual meetings? So the answer is yes, we certainly, as I mentioned, I typically, even without COVID, would include such language in bylaws because you just never know, for whatever reason, people can't physically be present. So feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to share more. I will also say I do have a slick sheet and form that you can refer to at churchattorney.com that just really outlines legal considerations for bylaws, and you can sort of use that as a guidepost as well. Let's see. I'll ask this question. Maybe Rich or some of you know the answer. Maybe Azuna, you do. But the question is, I have recently seen information on the web that Facebook will be changing its copyright language effective October 1st related to the use of recorded music, including when using Facebook Live. Are you aware of this, and what does it mean for live streaming? I'll say for my part, aware of that policy, but I think regardless of any changes in the policy, changes in the copyright law has not occurred. So I think the rules that we outlined earlier related to licensing, probably what I imagine is Facebook, along with other forms of social media, are likely becoming more stringent on their enforcement of these policies. So that's what I would imagine. Anyone else want to share on that question? All right. Another question for Dr. Manning. How do we counter the attitude that discussing racial injustice is a political issue and therefore now acceptable in church? Should I read that again?
Did they mean not acceptable in church?
I think that's what that means. How do we counter the attitude that discussing racial injustice is a political issue and therefore not acceptable in church? Yeah.
Erika, I found that people only say that when it's about political issues that they don't want to talk about. There are many political issues that we talk about all the time in church. On one side, someone will say, well, justice issues are political issues, therefore we shouldn't talk about them. But we don't say the same thing about, for instance, not coming down on any side, but for instance, we don't say that about abortion. Abortion is, or those persons, I would say, don't say that about abortion. The reality is of the fact is what, in my opinion, and how I combat that is this: where the Bible is silent, my normal inclination is to be silent. Where the Bible speaks, my inclination is to say what the Bible says. And there are too many references in the scripture about justice, righteousness, about loving the poor, about overturning systems that are unrighteous, for us not to talk about it and punt it by saying it's a political issue. Political simply means the governing of people. And when it comes to the governing of people, the Bible has a lot to say. And so for me to say it's a political issue, therefore we should not be talking about it, to me personally, it is inconsistent, because we have no problem talking about political issues that we feel passionate about and we feel the Bible speaks on. And so if the Bible speaks about it, then we should speak about it, is my normal response to that.
Well, even though we have a lot more questions, and I'm glad we were able to get through some of them, I appreciate each of you on our panel today. I'm giving you virtual applause, and I bet everybody else who is joining us is as well. So thank you so much. We are now going to go to our next presenter, who is Rob Eby. He is the lead partner in Aronson LLC and their nonprofit and association services group. He specializes in faith-based organizations. He will speak on ministry in an unstable revenue environment. Rob, it's been fantastic to work with you and our respective teams on planning today's events and seeing it come to fruition. I appreciate all that you've done to help make today very successful. So now to Rob.
Thanks, Erika. It has been a blessing to work with you and your team as well. I've really enjoyed each of the speakers. I've enjoyed the panelists. Pastor, I really appreciate making the point about the race is building relationship, building friendships, to understand and to care for one another. I believe this is a heart issue. And Mitch, I appreciate again your insights on opening the church and how to do it safely. And Azuna, you are tremendous in this space, and I appreciate all that you have done to help our firm and our clients and even the people on our presentation today. So with that, let me move into ministry in an unstable revenue environment. Here's where we're going to go. We're going to break that topic into two pieces. The first will be the unstable revenue environment. And this is really God's domain to understand kind of where this is going. And I'm going to talk about math, everybody's favorite subject in school, I'm sure. And then the other part of that is ministry. And that is in part our domain. And under that, we're going to look at 4 practical applications to help minister and manage our resources. And then we're going to end with, I think, something pretty exciting, pretty interesting that I hope that you'll get a chance to participate in. So let's start talking about math. Some of you are my age, you're around my age, and we learned about math in school, and there we take 1 + 1 and it equaled 2, and it equaled 2 all the time. Some of you are around my kids' age, and you're learning new math, and they learned new math. And there we take 1 + 6 - 5 = 2. This new math used to drive me nuts when I was trying to help my kids do their homework. But we got the same answer. The process was just very different. And so today, I don't want to necessarily talk about old school math or new math. I want to talk about God's math. The best way to explain God's math, I believe, is sharing examples from Scripture and personal examples. First example I want to share with you comes from Scripture about God's math, and this is in 2 Kings 4. And as I go through this, if you think of some illustrations of God's math in Scripture, put that into the chat, and I'll share those maybe in a little bit as well. So here in 2 Kings 4, we have a husband who died with some debt and leaves behind a wife and some kids. The lender comes to the wife and tries to take the children to help pay off or work off the debt. The wife reaches out to Elijah and says, look, I don't have any money, I don't have anything, I only have just a little bit of oil. And Elijah tells the lady to go to the neighbors, get all the empty jars she could, and then start to pour. And that's what she did. And she started to pour the oil into the jars, and one jar became full, and then another, and then another. And finally, all the jars were full. Elijah told the lady to use the oil, to sell it, to pay off the debt, and that she'd be able to live off the rest of the oil or the rest of the sales. Wow, see, that's God's math. It takes just a little bit of oil and produces a lot. Let me share with you an example from my life here in terms of God's math. Many of you know that I pastored a few churches for about 13 years. When I first went into ministry, I left one of the large consulting firms, and I took like a 75% pay cut to be a youth minister. Those of you who have been in youth ministry, you understand the pay structure there for us youth ministers. And during this first year of ministry, we hadn't been able to sell our house. So we had to pay a mortgage on our old house. We had to pay a rent on our new house. And during that time, our savings never declined. I don't know how that happens. I'm an accountant. I understand how these things should work. And it didn't. My wife is an accountant. She's a controller for a law firm. She didn't understand. This is God. This is how God's math works out. Had another example actually this summer. It was a blessing to me. I called one of my church clients, and this church I hadn't met in a few months. It was experiencing a leadership challenge, and giving had been flat for years. And when I asked them if the church had received or applied a PPP loan, they said they hadn't. And I asked why, and they said, well, we didn't think we could justify the need because our giving has been up 140%. It just doesn't make sense. But God blesses through this. This is a new math. Revenue is only unstable if we're using this old math or new math. I want to share with you some principal verses here of what I believe is God's math here. So let's look at Psalm 59 through 10. And it reads this: I have no need of a bull from your stall, or a goat from your pen. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. That's God's math. That's a fundamental point of God allocation of his resources. And that is that God has the resources necessary for us to do ministry. God may not allocate those resources in our time, but he always allocates them in his time. Another foundational verse that I appreciate comes from Malachi 3:10. It says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there might be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that I'll not have enough room for it. This is God's math. I love it. Look at this. If we bring 10% in, God's promise to throw open the floodgates of heaven's blessings. Any others that you can think of? Share with me. Yes, there's one there. This one comes in about the feeding of the 5,000. Here we have Jesus teaching, and there's about 5,000 people there. They're getting hungry, and the disciples find someone. They find 5 loaves and a few fish, and they break it up. Jesus prays for it. They break it up, and they end up collecting back 12 baskets after feeding the 5,000. We see a very similar story with the feeding of the 4,000. Again, we have 7 loaves of bread and a few fish, and after serving the 4,000, we end up collecting another 7 basketfuls of food. This is God's math. This is the hope of ministry, is that God releases what he has in his riches for us to use. Revenue is only unstable if we're using this new math or old math. So we have the theory down, I hope, and that is that God's math is unique. God blesses us and allows us to participate in ministry, and he brings these resources. So let me move our slide here. We looked at the foundational verses, but let's now look at some of the practical aspects here. So we understand that God has these resources, but let's look at the practical. What does that mean? Again, believing that the resources are readily available for us to use in ministry. This can be a way to encourage one another as well, as to see each other in ministry. The church needs this. The workers need this. The church has a lot of ministry to go. I really appreciate Pastor Manning sharing about racial reconciliation. This is an area where I believe the church should be working. I believe the church should be a leader in this racial reconciliation. It's a matter of the heart first and foremost, I believe. And believers should understand this because of their own reconciliation to the Lord. We also have another big area that the church is facing. The church has a mandate, and that is to care for the needy. This is true today, and it's true tomorrow. That there's a mandate that we need to work through. So let's look at some of the areas here, these 4 applications that I believe will help us move from the theory to actually application. And these are not a specific order, but these are just 4 ideas for you to look to implement and to begin to apply as you go about your work and about your ministry. So now that we believe in the theory that God's math provides for us, let's look at then the ministry, which is in part our work. Let's look at that and find some areas to apply. So the first is balancing ministry and financial health. First point we're going to look at. Second point is here, and that is using the reserve or operation. Some of you may be saying, and I know many of you on the line here have churches of 100 and less, and you say, wait a minute, we may not have a reserve. Well, I believe everybody has a reserve and has access to reserve. So we're going to talk about that in some more detail. The third point that we want to look at is the implementation of ERM and enterprise risk management. And this is something that I think all churches should look to apply. It's not something that's done in one day. It's a process, and it's something that should be repeated year after year. But I think it pays great dividends for the church. The third or the fourth point, and this is something that I'm excited about. I've had a chance to talk to a number of people about, but the fourth application point is this idea of reimagining. COVID has changed a lot. It's changed a lot of things in the church. It's changed a lot of things in our community. We have events in the news that are changing things in the church and changing things in our community. And we need to reimagine some of our ministries, specifically looking at some of our back office kind of ministries. Reimagine what your accounting department is going to look at. Reimagine what your IT department would look like. Reimagine what your HR department would look like, so that we can be prepared for when we are in our new post-COVID environment. So let's look here at balancing ministry and finance. And here's really where the tension builds. Under ministry, we want to spend, we want to produce new ministry, we want to expand those that we can do. The temptation there is to spend and to use the resources. But on the other side, the tension is financial health. Often requires changes in programs, maybe a reduction in service, delaying spending. This is where the tension is involved, and this is where true leadership needs to step in and help create this balance. Because in times of crisis, like our country is going through now, there's a greater demand on our service, there's a greater demand for our ministry, as well as a greater demand on our financial resources. And we need to understand how to balance this and how to use the resources that God has given us. So we also need to understand here this idea of about starting and stopping a ministry, demand for new programming and being proactive in communication. Let me say a little bit here about this idea of starting and stopping a ministry. This really is a long-term look, and this could involve killing that sacred cow. Those cows are kind of hard to catch and kill, but put that cow and your people out of misery. Look for these long-term things. Understand who you are as a church, and work to kill those programmings or change those programmings so that they benefit others. The second part of that is obviously the short term, and that is being able to pivot. And Erika used this word, and I like it as well. This idea of pivot your ministries so that you can continue to move forward. have a great example of this actually in my own church, and I'm proud of our pastor for this and the leaders. They felt that they had a vision or mission from God, and that was as they express it, they're trusting God to multiply diverse communities of people, transforming and empowering them for the gospel. That was their mission statement. That's what they feel that our church has been called to do. Well, at the same time, our building was way out kind of in the country. No one was going really by there. And so while most churches want to acquire a building at some time, they actually sold the building, and we've become kind of nomadic, even more nomadic because of COVID. And so we've met in hotels, we've met in schools, and now we're even meeting outside because the schools are shut down to being rented. And that's this idea really of balancing ministry and financial health. And so I admire what Pastor Jeff Martin did with that change. And we also need to consider in these situations, as I mentioned, there's a demand for new programming. What will it take? Are there new leaders? I appreciate what Rick Warren said in his book, saying basically that when people came to approach him to bring in a new ministry, to start a new ministry, he always said, you know, who's going to champion this? Who are the leaders? We don't just want to throw things on the wall and hope they stick. We want to know, is there staying power? Is there a leader who's going to drive this and make it their own? And so when we're looking at balancing this ministry and financial health, we look for the new leaders, for the new programming that may need to arise. And then being proactive with our communication in this situation. Communicate what you're doing. Communication motivates people and gives direction. Let members and staff know in a crisis, the time to be is the time to be involved. And their efforts actually make a difference. And so proactive communication helps. It explains why you're making a change. It explains why you're pivoting. In the situation of my church, it explained why we would sell the building and become nomadic. And it makes sense because people took the time to communicate to us as members. So we need to be able to balance missions and financial health and understand that there is a tension, a healthy tension there, and it's heightened during crisis. So let's look at the next area here, and that is using operating reserves. And I understand that some of your churches may not have a large reserve, but I believe that still having this policy, having this practice will help you when God does bless. Because again, I believe God does bless ministries that are working within their calling. So here's some thoughts on using operating reserves and building policies around the use of those. And that is have a plan to build and use your financial resources. As we think about the purpose of a reserve, there's really only two purposes. They may be said in different ways, but there's really only two purposes. One is a rainy day fund to get through a short crisis, to get through a short-term problem, and the other is strategic growth. And this is making investments that will pay dividends in the long run. So you also have within this, I believe, this use of reserves of an understanding of your staff and your people and how they want to minister. So the strategy employs the use of the resources. When to spend. Do we spend 10% right away at the beginning of the crisis? Do we jump all in? Do we hold some in reserve? How do we spend? How much do we spend in this? The tension here again is the timing and how much. And if you've taken time to develop a policy around use of reserves, you're able to respond in a quicker manner than you would if you didn't have a policy on reserves. And this takes some time to develop this policy. A few takeaways in this area. Have a plan for how to use paid and volunteer resources. Allow the paid resources to do certain things and allow the volunteers to do others. And so that, again, in times of crisis or in times of strategic growth, people know what's expected and how to move forward. Refocus the shorter timeline when projecting financial resources. When we're trying to understand who we are as a church, as a unique ministry, we look long-term. But when we're in a crisis, when we're dealing with a specific project, we're looking short-term. And here we need to refocus the short-term when projecting financial resources. Understand that cash is king. Cash allows the church to be nimble and be responsive. And here, part of the role of the finance team, the financial employees, is to help the church retain cash and manage cash in such a way that the church can be responsive and nimble to the needs. And a couple ways to do that is through cash flow projections. I think they're a powerful tool. And it's similar to a budgeting, but you work through, okay, what is the normal resources here, maybe the resources over the past 3 months, come up with an average for the resources that may be coming in, and then work through your expenses to be able to project the cash that could be available to you. I also like this idea of micro budgets. Here, we're used to, as organizations, we're used to developing a 12-month budget. But because of COVID, I mean, I don't think any of us can really say we know where we're going to be in 12 months. I'm not sure that until there's a COVID vaccine and it's readily available, we're really going to be able to project our vision that far. So I encourage people to, yes, go ahead and develop your 12-month budget if that's what's sort of required, but break it down into 3-month budgets. This allows for more control over the resources over that period of time and helps you to stay focused in this time period, in this moment, instead of being tempted to look out a long ways beyond kind of where we can see. You may even need to develop within this 3-month budget, you may even need to be able to develop some micro budgets under that in terms of like a best case scenario, worst case scenario, and a most likely scenario. So that again, you have sort of a range to work in and kind of understand where you're going. I also think within this plan for using operating reserves, part of the plan is to build an operating reserve and to understand that that's a component as well. And to do that well, I believe you need to have a gift acceptance policy. And if you don't have a gift acceptance policy, I'd really encourage you to get one so that you don't end up accepting things or accepting terms of a donor that you as a church don't want to accept or don't want to bind yourself into. So as a church, are you willing to still accept cash? A lot of churches are trying to really encourage online giving through apps, through bank ACH type payments. Are you still willing to accept cash? Will you accept Bitcoin? Will you take precious metals? Will you accept an interest in a privately held company? Each of these have advantages and disadvantages, and in this new environment, you really need to think through as you're building the reserve. You know, what are you willing to accept? And then the same thing with terms. A donor may make a restriction on the funding. I have a client that accepted a gift for a prayer garden. And while that's a great idea, and I can envision it just as I'm sure the donor could envision this beautiful, grassy, peaceful area and maybe a few benches and a little waterfall, that's all great. But this church is landlocked. They have parking lots and buildings all surrounding them. It's impossible for them to build a prayer garden. But they're kind of stuck with this and trying to find that donor and trying to see if they can reallocate and use those funds for another service. So understand the donor's intent is very important, and you may need to set up a parameter and say, these are areas where we're willing to restrict or accept donor restrictions, and everything else, if it's outside of that, it either needs to be unrestricted or we're not interested in accepting it. So think through those gift acceptance policies as you're looking to build a reserve. The next The next area here is in the area of enterprise risk management. So oftentimes we run into these risks and they hit us before we're really willing and able to interact with them. Let me start by giving you a definition of what really is enterprise risk management, and I'm very excited about this area here. I think this is something that's a great exercise for our churches to do. Enterprise risk management is a plan-based strategy that aims to identify, access, and prepare for any dangers, hazards, and other potential for danger, both physical and figurative. That may interfere with the church's operations and objectives. The discipline not only calls for a church to identify all the risks they face and to decide which risks to manage actively, but it also involves making a plan of action available to all the stakeholders, all the members, all the leaders. The biggest risk may not be the most urgent risk. Let me give you an example here. You have a senior pastor. That senior pastor is going to leave someday. Is this a big risk? Yes. Senior pastor is leaving is a big risk. Is it an urgent risk? Let's say your senior pastor is excited to be here. He's invested in the community and he's 30 years old. He's probably not leaving anytime soon. But let's say he is 65. He's been there for a long time. He's already communicated he's interested in leaving by the time he's 67. That is a bigger risk and needs to be addressed right away. So that's an example. Another one would be maybe you have a mortgage and it has a large balloon payment in there. That's a risk. It's a big risk, but it may or may not be urgent, depending upon the reserve, if you have a plan, if you don't have a plan there. Some of the other areas that I see some of you have already keyed in some of these big risks, and one is not just a minister, but a key leader, and I think that's a great point. There, someone mentioned having a key leader if they were to pass away. That could have a major impact on the ministry. So let's sort of walk through the 5 steps here, and then I'm going to show you some charts and graphs that I think will be of real help to you if you want to adopt this. And again, we're happy to help you adopt it, happy to talk through this with you, but let's look at this. So the first is preparing a risk inventory. Second is assessing risk. Third is developing a risk migration plan. Fourth is monitoring the progress, and fifth is reporting to leaders. So let's look at this, the first step here, and this is sampling or identifying the risks out there. And here's what you're going to do. You're going to develop some sort of spreadsheet like this. And again, feel free to lift this, use this if you would like. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to solicit from as many leaders, whether they're volunteered or paid, across a diverse area of ministries, to identify what are the risks that the church is facing, or even will face. So some of those risks are unique. I shared with you the idea and the comment from Richard here about the death of a minister or a key leader. Those are risks that all churches face, but you may have, and most likely you do, each church has some unique risks that they need to address. And so you want a broad perspective to come in and weigh on what are those risks. The next area is looking at the assessing. So you have your whole risk, you have your big risks here. Then you have to weigh them and assess them. Where do they fall on the sensitivity curve? And so on the slide that's here in front of you, you have a couple examples. For example, a data breach, and this is where you're hoping someone like Azuna is on your team. So what's the impact? Well, if there's a ransomware, as he shared, the impact could be great. What's the probability? We all know the saying, it's not if an attack happens, but it's when. So the probability is medium to high. And so what would your sensitivity be? Your sensitivity is going to be high. Whereas some of the other risks down here, like the senior pastor transition, the impact will be moderate, no doubt, but the probability is low. He's very involved in the community. He keeps praising the opportunity to work with this particular leadership and the like. So the sensitivity there, the severity there is low. And so you take these risks and you score them in this manner. And again, it allows you to be able to better direct your resources. And so you take that information that was on this chart here and then begin to build this so that you know where to apply your resources, whether those are paid staff or volunteers. So in this situation, you see the first line, we have a high impact, low probability. Well, maybe that's not the first thing we want to tackle. The first thing we'd want to tackle is something in the high impact and high probability there. And here's where we're developing the mitigation plan. This is where, okay, we've gathered all the risks, we've put them into a rating, and we now understand where our most significant risks are, where we should be directing most of our people, our energy, our leaders, our finances into these areas. And let me step back just a second and say a risk is not just something bad happening. A risk can also be strategic too. And so a risk could be the lack of having a quality worship team. Well, that could be a risk in your congregation. And so there's an opportunity risk that's being assumed. So it's a risk of loss, but it's also a risk of not doing something. So that you need to factor both of those in when you're assessing risks. But then you get down here to this mitigation plan. And again, feel free to use this or develop something better. If you develop something better, that's great. Let me see it, shoot it over to me. I'd love to do that. But here's where you're going to summarize those risks or put a description. How are you going to mitigate it? And then what's the implementation status? And then you're going to monitor the risks. We want to see how we're doing. We want to make sure that the plan is in place. We want to know if we need to redirect. Risks change, and so we would expect our plan to change. Leaders, volunteer leaders especially, that come and go, we need to make sure that there's a leader assigned to each of these risks so that they can be working through them. And then the last area here is reporting the progress to leaders. And here, my experience with working with leaders is that they get a lot of information that they have to process. And the easier you can make your information digestible by the leaders, the better. And so I think these, which are often referred to as heat maps, are a great way to kind of look and see where we are and where those resources need to go. So in this one here, you can see that down in the bottom right-hand corner, we have 9 risks that we've decided have a very high impact and very high likelihood. Well, we need to, as a church, be addressing those areas first and foremost, far more than the 4 risks we've identified up with a low impact and low probability. Even though one risk may seem a lot bigger, this helps us identify where we need to develop those resources. So here's a fun exercise for you. It's something I enjoy before we look at this next, what I call bonus opportunity for here. But let's reimagine, where are we post-COVID? And I know everybody wants to get post-COVID. I want to get post-COVID. But let's think through what are things going to be like post-COVID so that we can now begin to develop an infrastructure or communications for when we are in post-COVID. And here's just some thoughts before we move in. Your recruiting practices. I know a lot of churches struggle to find quality people in their accounting and finance and HR department. Well, now with COVID proving that we can work remotely, you can recruit people from anywhere in the nation to work with you. So your recruiting practice is going to go up. You may end up using more independent contractors than employees because, again, You can recruit from any place, and they may not necessarily need to be employees. It's going to be much less paper. We need to move away from a dependence on that. Use other sources. Shared resources. Look, if you are a smaller church and there's a few other smaller churches, maybe you can hire one accounting department and service each of the 3 churches. And then IT and AI are going to grow and continue to impact ministry and the opportunities before us. So I'd encourage you to take time with your leadership and really reimagine what's happening there. And I hope as a takeaway, not only do you try some of these 4 practical areas, but I hope you remember God's math. It's his church, it's his people, and it's his resources. And there's enough examples through scripture that I hope that you're encouraged that God can work through you and can work through your church and can do so in amazing ways, even in the midst of COVID. And I would say definitely in the midst of COVID, the church needs to be a leader and has that opportunity to really make a lasting impact. Thanks for that. Let me shift over to a new idea that Erika and I would like to kind of share with you. And this is as an idea of executive roundtables. So what we would like to offer this year is to, if you're interested, you can sign up to be a part of a roundtable. We'll probably have about 15 people or so in the roundtables. And either Erika or one of her team or me or one of my team will sit in on these. And they'll be self-directed small groups, so they'll meet quarterly. And here you're going to be able to share peer-to-peer ideas. You'll be able to bounce ideas off of one another. The group itself will set the agenda. Potential topics are anything you can imagine, anything that would be a blessing or that you're interested in. And here's just some sample ones that I've received just recently. Questions about financial reporting, best practice over internal controls, legal issues with intellectual property, unrelated business income taxes, staff recruiting and training, all these ideas. And so if you're interested in participating in something like this, we are going to start some. There may be limited. We have a lot of people that participated and listened to the survey or the presentation today. So we'll try to get as many people who would like to be on one of these things. They'll be virtual. They'll last about an hour. And I think it'll just give you an opportunity to develop a network of peers that can help your church and you in ministry. So how will you register? You're going to get an email at the end of the session sometime the next day or so, and there's going to be an opportunity to register. And there'll also be a survey there, maybe so that we can gain some information so that we can join more homogeneous groups together so that the groups may work a little bit more efficiently and each person's needs are really being met. And so I'm excited about this. I think this could be a blessing to you. And with that said, let me thank you all for your time and let me turn it over to Erika.
Thank you, Rob, for your presentation, for all that you've shared. I might just add that registration for these executive roundtables will be like today's conference. It'll be free, it'll be virtual, it'll be great. I'm going to coin that. I loved what you shared too about the heat map. I'm such a visual learner, and I think a lot of people might take information that way. That was really helpful. So again, I just maybe we want to sum up by saying I want to thank everyone for attending the 2020 Church Law and Finance Conference. Rob and I have pivoted to this virtual platform. We have done what some churches may do, as Rob suggested, sharing resources, coming together. And we're really grateful that each of you was able to join us. We also want to just thank our respective staff, the marketing team, the networking people, Clara, GoToWebinar. I want to thank Mame Yamache, who's an associate attorney who works directly with me in the Churches and Faith-Based Organizations group, my firm, Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, and the support throughout. So we're grateful that you were with us today. We are giving everybody about 27 seconds of your time back as it just turned 1 o'clock, so we're right on time. Thank you so much. We will look forward to hearing from you, and God bless, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.